borrowing from this ecological model, the book describes how we can use this framework to understand and to work with stakeholders in conflict to understand what changes are occurring in the system that could lead to conflict, what social and institutional vulnerabilities there are in the system that could lead to a collapse or lead to conflict, what potential flashpoints or triggers could spark a conflict, a new conflict erupting. This could spark the system to collapse. And based on all of that information, which actions, which initiatives, or which interventions might be able to facilitate the reorganization of the system into a more beneficial state. Again, where beneficial is socially, economically, and environmentally beneficial. So that's all great, but the final piece of it is who needs to be involved in these processes, and how do we encourage them to jump into or agree to be involved in a collaborative process? The key is to avoid conflicts escalating into a destructive set of patterns. So this is a graph from the book that describes how conflicts move over time or how they evolve over time and how they can escalate from just simple differences of opinion or contradictions or incompatible needs into, at the worst case, all-out violence or war. If we don't go to that extreme case, we can think of large political deadlock or legal battles, or really entrenched dynamics. Those are what we call destructive dynamics. When it collapses into this place, it's really hard to move the system into a more cooperative or constructive way of engagement amongst stakeholders.
In China, there are lots of environmental conflicts, especially in recent decades, because China is rising up during their economic reform. So mainly, the conflicts are caused by those actual laws. So those conflicts are between the firms, the industries, and the local committees and local citizens. And so therefore, I think it's like a net zero game. So then the government jumped in and make some, to identify some common interests, and then as our Chinese would say, to make a larger pie and to make the game be a win-win game. So I think in the last 2 decades in China, our policymakers are following those approach. And the second, there are some other environmental, which is not related with those actual laws, but with those perceived uncertainty. And so that's also cause lots of fear, anxiety in the public. So fear or uncertainty is not really calculated or really perceived, but it's kind of a main issue. Third type of conflicts are really between the human and the planet. I think in China, environmental NGO is not quite well established, or those environmental NGO are basically focused on local issue or like the issue related with the actual laws. So I think in that part is not really emphasized in China's policymaker perspective.
So the key is to build social capital among stakeholders. Social capital is important because what it does is it serves to build connections, increase resources, and increase information in the system, and pull the system from this destructive dynamic into more cooperative, collaborative spaces. And if we think about this in terms of the decision-making space, here when we're in destructive dynamics, there's very little space for decision making, and so we're left with some, a small set of actions we can take to manage the conflict: peacekeeping, peace enforcement. But here, when we have more social capital, we have a wider decision making space, and so there's a whole range of initiatives that we can implement to try and manage conflict. So social capital is the key because it increases the resources available to stakeholders in conflict. So the goal is really to work to build social capitals among parties in conflict and increase that decision making space. There are 3 engines for collaboration, or 3 gears in an engine, in the motor, if you will. Those are principled engagement, shared motivation, and capacity for joint action. Each one functions independently and serves a different purpose. Principled engagement serves to create a shared normative framework or principled framework where stakeholders agree to a process. The second piece is building off those principles to create a shared identity as members of this collaborative governance initiative, and increase over time our motivation to work together through building trust, building understanding, having an internally legitimate governance body, and having an externally legitimate governance body. And as these components start to work together, we increase our shared commitment to the process and our motivation to be involved in the process. The third piece is really critical, and that's building capacity among the stakeholders for joint action. So it's great to have the rules that we're going to engage each other on and the motivation to work together, but unless the process works for the different stakeholders, unless it helps me meet my needs or increases your resource base, we're not going to continue working together. If we can't agree on the rules that we're going to engage each other on, then over time, as change accumulates in the system, we may have a fundamental disagreement on what's ethical, what's fair, and we can see the system break down. So each of these is a necessary component to collaboration, but individually they're not sufficient to enable a collaborative process.
If their voice can be heard either by their opinion leaders or by their government or by NGOs, that's how give them a greater chance to get repaid. Because in China's policy-making process, there are only some few people, few agencies they discuss the strategy, and in China's culture or philosophy, that those disabled people group already be represented by government. So they believe, they present the people's interest. Their voice cannot be heard, so their interest cannot be represented. Second, I think we need to change our representative bureaucratic system. And we believe that our system represents people's interest, but it's not always the fact.
The book talks about power imbalances as well. Understand that the Chinese governance structure is more top-down, right, traditionally. So I guess in a multi-level governance framework, right? So how can government agencies at different levels collaborate effectively? And to follow up on that, how can state actors, work with the non-state state actors, right? Which are also key stakeholders, often in environmental conflicts.
In terms of people's voice being heard, that's described in the book as procedural justice. People are more likely to be willing to engage in a process or engage with or accept an environmental management decision that's made top-down if they can see their perspective, their fears, their needs represented in the process for decision-making. Procedural justice is really critical to ensuring that you're setting up the potential for people to want to engage in the decision process and accept the outcomes of the decision.